saying Britain Trump. They call him Britain Trump, and people are saying that's a good thing. That they like me over there. That's what they wanted. That's what they need.
Come on, England!
VisualPolitik fans, even Donald Trump himself said it. Boris Johnson has been branded on numerous occasions as the Trump of British politics. And it's not just an aesthetic comparison, or that both leaders constantly generate a lot of content for the tabloids. Because yes, we know that the private lives of these two characters are anything but discreet. Both are in their third marriages, and both came to power with 5 children each. The difference is that Boris Johnson, amongst all his partying, has had 2 more offspring in his time as Premier. But perhaps there is no better formula for combating the aging of the British population than a baby boom at 10 Downing Street. Whatever the case, Johnson's fall has been particularly striking, considering that just 2.5 years ago, this British Prime Minister was able to reap a resounding electoral success, the largest Conservative majority since the days of Margaret Thatcher. So it was a surprising fall for a leader, who in September 2021 imagined himself to be the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the modern era.
Boris Johnson eyes another decade in power.
Just a few months before being forced to resign, Johnson aspired to surpassing Margaret Thatcher's 11 years in power. In the end, his run remains at a little over 3 years. So the question is, how did such a peculiar guy as Johnson ever come to be resident in Downing Street? What is the balance sheet of his era as Prime Minister? What really brought about his downfall? In this video, we're going to answer these questions, but first, we have to start at the beginning. So this means we need to look at a bit of history.
Who cares about the truth?
Boris Johnson lying to Parliament about his attendance during confinement at Downing Street parties did not come as a surprise to those who follow British politics closely. Johnson's career is littered with moments when he struggled with the truth. In fact, the lack of commitment to truth is, perhaps, one of the great weaknesses of this politician. Do you think we're exaggerating? Well, no. Throughout Johnson's professional and political career, this stain has always been very present. But let's start at the beginning. After studying at the prestigious Eton College, and then reading classics at Oxford University, Johnson began his professional career as a journalist for The Times, from which he was fired for making up a quote. After this incident, he was rescued by the Daily Telegraph, where he wrote columns that began to connect him with the Conservative electorate. And in the early 1990s, he was posted as a correspondent in Brussels, where he began to gain fame for his hardline Eurosceptical positions. And this was something Johnson did in a big way. Whether or not he had reason on his side, his style always used exaggeration to ridicule the EU institutions. In his pieces, Johnson went so far as to say things such as that the European Commission wanted to ban shrimp cocktails and British sausages, or even that it was seeking to standardise the size of prophylactics because Italians had smaller sexual organs. Back in the UK, he continued to work as a columnist and ran, unsuccessfully, for election to the House of Commons. But little by little, thanks to his work, and above all to his continuous appearances on the BBC's Have I Got News For You programme, he began to become a well-known figure. He then received an offer to become editor of The Spectator, a weekly magazine on politics, culture, and international affairs. The condition, however, was that he would not run for Parliament, which Johnson agreed to, and of course, 2 years later, reneged on. As a politician, he won the confidence of the then Conservative leader Michael Howard, although he was soon removed after the media exposed Boris's lies about an affair, another of his great passions. Nevertheless, the fact is that in 2008, Boris Johnson became Mayor of London. His performance as Mayor earned him great popularity. This allowed him to win re-election. His popularity spread throughout the whole country and also the international community after the hosting of the 2012 Olympic Games. In such a context, and enjoying very high approval ratings, he did what he said at least 1,000 times that he would not do: run as a candidate for the 2015 parliamentary elections. And so, from the House of Commons, he became one of the most prominent figures in calling for the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, playing a particular stellar role in the 2016 referendum. At the time, the Conservative Party had been in power for 6 years with David Cameron as Prime Minister. That referendum was called for many reasons, but this, you see on the screen, was one of the main arguments. You see, after the Great Recession, many British politicians, economists, and experts who were skeptical of the European Union argued that the blame for the poor performance of the British economy had a lot to do with precisely the burden of the European club. Johnson, who moved like a fish in water in this field, was one of the great speakers for this campaign from the outset. A campaign that, I'm sure I needn't remind you, was a success and ended with the resignation of David Cameron. With the subsequent appointment of Theresa May in the top job to enforce Brexit, Johnson, as a representative of the most hardcore wing of Brexit supporters, was appointed Foreign Secretary and remained in office for the first 2 years of the 3 years of this government. A government that was a failure. Theresa May, who did not believe in Brexit, did not manage to make practically any progress. And so, amid doubts about whether Brexit would really be possible, the opportunity came for our protagonist of this video. On 24th of July 2019, Boris Johnson became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Suddenly, the discourse changed completely, and 5 months later, in the elections of 12th of December, Boris Johnson crushed all of his rivals. The United Kingdom had a new emperor, at least in political terms.
Let's do this!
Boris Johnson's election campaign in 2019 was very clear. He asked for the vote to achieve 2 things: to carry out Brexit without looking back, and to prevent Jeremy Corbyn, the then far left-leaning Labour leader, from taking over the British government. It was a success. The classic Conservative fiefdoms were joined by many traditional Labour constituencies that had backed Brexit and were not particularly enthusiastic about their candidate's left-wing populism. And so, VisualPolitik viewers, many things can be said, but on this occasion, Boris Johnson kept his word. After his crushing defeat, Corbyn was left out of the political front line, and just when it seemed impossible, the British Prime Minister managed to close a deal with the European Union so that Brexit would be fully completed by 31st of January 2020. It is true that the agreement was not exactly what the hardline Brexit hooligans wanted, since Northern Ireland continues to belong to the European single market for goods, something that has since been a huge headache and an inexhaustible source of political conflict. Why? Because belonging to the European goods market means not being part of the British market itself. This trade border in the Irish Sea makes many in Britain uncomfortable, and even Johnson himself frequently threatened to break the so-called Northern Irish Protocol. And that's not all. Brexit is an opportunity, but also a risk. Whether it will turn out better or worse in the medium and long term will essentially depend on the policies adopted by the British government. This seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? The problem is that it was sold otherwise. Many pro-Brexit leaders, including Johnson himself, painted the picture that everything would be a bed of roses, that the mere exit from the European Union would mean something like turbocharging the economy, and that suddenly everyone would be richer and more prosperous. But the reality is the opposite. In the short term, Brexit means a lot of uncertainty and the need to carry out endless adjustments that slow down the economy. For example, according to data from the Centre of European Reform, so far, Brexit has meant a 10% drop in investment and trade for the UK, compared to global growth of 6%. Yes, in the medium to long term, it could be a great opportunity, but that will require time, patience, and above all, policies that improve British competitiveness. And here, Johnson has not been particularly up to the task either. He has presented many interesting grand plans, but when it comes down to it, very little has been implemented and very little progress has actually been made. Instead, what he has done is to spend hand over fist and increase taxes on business. That's something that has also contributed to eroding his clout within the Conservative movement. But we can't just talk about Brexit and its consequences. The Johnson era leaves us with many more stories. Listen up.
Half-truths as policy.
VisualPolitik viewers, foreign policy has been the area where the changes brought about by Brexit are most noticeable by far. While the European machinery tends to be slow and ponderous, London has become much more agile in establishing its position on the major issues on the international scene, which has meant that Boris Johnson himself is now more beloved abroad than in his own country. For example, check out who was most delighted that Johnson overcame a no-confidence motion in June.
Я щасливий, правда. Я вважаю, що Джонсон реальний друг України. Я вважаю його нашим союзником, я вважаю Британію нашим великим другом.
Indeed, the UK is supporting Ukraine wholeheartedly. In fact, in Ukraine, they are so grateful to Boris Johnson that they have dedicated a street to him in the city of Odessa. And it surely won't be the last. Then, the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom marked another major diplomatic victory, something along the lines of London is back on the international stage. But the good news pretty much stops there. You see, another area in which he ultimately achieved outstanding leadership was in the management of the pandemic. The British government made a strong commitment to vaccines and achieved vaccination rates similar to those achieved by Israel in the early stages of the vaccination process. Something that also caused Brexit supporters to stick out their chests with graphs like this one. Of course, not everything went so well for him. At the national level, his flagship policy was known as levelling up. His aim was to achieve greater economic development in the Midlands of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. In other words, in all those parts of the country that have not been as successful as the London metropolitan area and the major English cities. The idea was to greatly increase public investment in those areas. For decades, the UK government has talked about reducing the inequalities between the dynamism of London and the south of England and the rest of the UK. Much has been said, but little has been done, and with little success. Everything continues to be concentrated in the city. Everything indicates that this will continue to be the case for the time being. Well, betting on levelling up had an added incentive for Johnson. His absolute majority meant that the Tories obtained MPs in the most unexpected places. And this has generated two currents in the Conservative Party. The classic liberal current of the Tories in London and the South East has been joined by another movement, a very conservative but much more interventionist one, that of the North and the Midlands, which is calling for a sharp increase in public spending. And that is where Johnson had wanted to stake much of his political capital. And for that, the government had to mobilise huge amounts of public investment. The problem, of course, is that resources are not finite. Stimulus plans to support the post-COVID recovery, coupled with the costs of the pandemic itself, and the UK government's plans, have brought about something that could doom the Conservative Party, even if Margaret Thatcher herself were here.
UK is among first Western nations to increase taxes to cover COVID-19 costs.
VisualPolitik viewers, the British healthcare system is not at its best. Waiting lists are multiplying and affecting millions of patients. And as economic growth is far from what was expected, and even further from what was promised during the Brexit campaign, Boris Johnson sought to increase his resources by pulling the old classic, raising taxes. In this way, he increased the taxation on workers' salaries by 2.5 points to be shared equally between companies and their employees. In addition, the corporate tax rate will increase from 19% to 25% in April 2023. The driving force behind these measures was Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was reportedly opposed to financing the spending expansions entirely with debt. Whatever the case, what is clear is that stimulus plans may be more or less popular, but raising taxes is something that almost nobody likes, especially on the Conservative side, especially at a time like this.
UK inflation hits new 40-year high of 9.4% as cost of living crisis deepens.
And then there's the energy crisis and the ever-increasing bills for British households. So naturally, broken promises, disappointments, inflation, and tax rises have eroded Boris Johnson's political capital and his supporters within the Conservative Party. Of course, his resignation has had much more to do with his personal behaviour than with the mediocre performance he has achieved so far. Listen up.
Deception as a survival method.
At this point, it is also not worth going into too much detail about all of Boris Johnson's comings and goings with the Partygate scandal. And just a side note, can we stop attaching the Gate tagline to any scandal? It's not like Watergate was a water scandal. Johnson tried to fool the British people, Parliament, and everyone else. The reality is that in May 2020, a bunch of senior government officials gathered in Downing Street Gardens for their traditional Friday drinks, while the rest of the British population were banned from socialising and doing practically anything other than being at home or possibly at work. Thanks for that. So you can imagine the outrage provoked by news items like this.
Boris Johnson fined by police over lockdown-breaking parties at UK government premises.
In response to this, Johnson even said that, well, nobody had warned him that attending those events was in breach of the rules of social distancing approved by his own government. As you can imagine, in the face of such an obvious porky, there were many Tories who began to withdraw their support for the Prime Minister. Johnson then launched a so-called Operation Red Meat, a desperate attempt to regain the support of his own people. This Operation Red Meat included such crazy policies as handing over control of the English Channel to the Royal Navy, which does not have adequate vessels to combat illegal immigration. It also included an agreement to deport undocumented immigrants to African countries such as Rwanda or Nigeria, something that made Prince Charles of England put aside his neutrality to describe this policy as appalling. And so Johnson gradually lost the confidence of the Tories to the point that in early June 2022, they presented him with a vote of no confidence. Johnson managed to overcome the motion, but his government was mortally wounded. And the final straw for the Prime Minister was the Pincher scandal. Chris Pincher was a senior member of the Conservative Party parliamentary group who resigned at the end of June after being accused of sexually assaulting 2 men. The scandal erupted when it became known that Pincher had been appointed to this post by Boris Johnson, despite the fact that the latter already knew that he had similar allegations from his time at the Foreign Office. The Pincher scandal led to the immediate resignation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, and also of the Minister of Health, Sajid Javid, who was very eloquent before Parliament in defining the drift Johnson was taking.
But treading the tightrope between loyalty and integrity has become impossible in recent months. I have concluded that the problem starts at the top, and I believe that is not going to change. And that means that it is for those of us in a position who have responsibility to make that change.
The resignation of these 2 ministers was the beginning of the end. In just 36 hours, as many as 50 senior government officials resigned from their posts. And that was the end, at least for now, of Boris Johnson. And I say for now because there are already rumours that the British leader is set to return to the front row to regain the throne that has been snatched from him. Be that as it may, his farewell in the British Parliament left no one indifferent.
Some words of advice to my successor, whoever he or she may be. Number 1, stay close to the Americans, stick up for the Ukrainians, stick up for freedom and democracy everywhere. Hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
But now we've reached this point, it's now time for all of you. What memory will Boris Johnson leave in your mind? What advice would you give the future British Prime Minister? Leave us your answers in the comments. And as always, if you found the video interesting, don't forget to like and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik. All the best. I'll see you next time.